Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram, and MeWe. And of course, be sure to visit mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
In a couple of weeks, the new school year begins. This year isn't going to be anything like past years. Courts have ordered cross-district busing in the poorest white and black neighborhoods.
Dad, I'm scared.
Black people have to be ready to make one choice in America. And that's the choice whether to stay in control when white people are out of control.
Johnny's back.
They let you out.
Just in time for the fireworks.
It's gonna be chaos. It's not right. And my little girl will have to go to school and all this madness. I don't want to go to their damn school. No, they want a bunch of kids who hate each other to walk hand in hand and sing Kumbaya.
This busing thing is driving me crazy.
They're not like us.
They're just not like us.
I deal with racist people all the time, and I don't say anything. So what does that make me?
Hey, look who thinks they can drive through Southie. This busing gonna rip this city apart.
You have to be brave. If kids like me don't go, there'll be no change.
It's time for your justice.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 436. Released in June 10 in theaters across the US is The Walk, a historical drama that tells the story of a Boston Irish cop who tries to keep the peace in his South Boston neighborhood during the forced integration of the Boston school system in 1974. Featuring terrific performances from a star-studded cast and a no-flinch approach to depiction of a tense-filled time where racial hatred was confronted by those who chose to follow the command of to love thy neighbor. The Walk is also the latest film from director Daniel Adams, who I'm very happy to say joins me now on the podcast. Daniel, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Matt. I'm really happy to be here. I really appreciate it.
So it's really interesting just reading up about yourself in this movie, and it's, you know, you have somewhat of a personal connection to these events. Was it true that your father was like a part of the council, or was a political activist of some sort, and that kind of like really went into loggerheads with what was happening at that time in 1974 in Boston?
Yeah, absolutely. He was a civil rights activist in the 60s and 70s, and he was appointed to the Massachusetts Commission on Discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
He was a judge who heard discrimination cases, even though he wasn't a lawyer. But and then he also was on the Boston Committee on Civic Unity. And at that time, they were tasked with trying to help integrate the schools. Unfortunately, the method was busing, forced busing, and which caused all this consternation. So some of my earliest childhood memories were, getting rocks thrown through our window and getting death threats from, on the phone for my father and so forth, because it was a very rough time. My dad, he was the first white member of the NAACP in New England, the New England chapter, and it was a crazy time, and so in a way, it was a lot of created a lot of childhood trauma as far as I was concerned as a kid, and so the film is almost cathartic in a way, in that sense, but it's also an important film or at least an important subject anyway, because it's important to things have gotten worse, in my opinion, not better, since 1974. So it's I hope a very relevant film.
It feels like a very relevant film, but just hearing you talk about it as well, and the kind of cathartic nature of the screenplay and the movie. It's interesting though that this wasn't really a film that was initially your idea to put on screen. It was your co-writer, George Powell. He's the one that kind of brought up the idea, right? And then you said, I got sounds like a good idea. Do you feel that, say, if maybe he brought up this idea, I don't know, just like a hypothetical, maybe 10, 20 years ago, you have been in the mindset at the right time to tackle that project? Or do you think, considering the events and how things are so relevant now more than ever, that it was just the right time at the right place to bring this kind of story forward?
Yeah, well, George, my co-writer, George Powell, he knew about my childhood experiences, and so he was thinking of something that that I might be interested in doing. But unfortunately, racism has never really gone away, and but so even if it were 10, 15 years ago or whatever, it would have been relevant. But that being said, it's never been more relevant than today. And I don't know. I mean, we've as a society, we thought the zeitgeist was moving. That in the right direction over the last few decades. That we were getting past our racist and past on our the history of slavery in this country, and we were trying to balance the scales with the Civil Rights Act and so on and so forth, and even more recently LGBTQ rights and so forth. And turns out one politician comes around and all of a sudden it's everything that was sort of masked and hidden is now out in the open again, and it's just it's frightening, and I think that even though maybe a decade ago I would have been interested in the subject, and because of my experiences I would have been interested in doing it, I don't think the industry would have been interested in making the film as much as it is now. And so I think in that sense, it's very timely. We have, and especially where we have it's being released a few days before Juneteenth, and it's hopefully people will go see it, and it'll raise some discussion, which I'm hoping.
It's really interesting how the opening scenes of the film you show in juxtaposition these two different communities are separated essentially by race. One of those communities is South Boston. Now, when people hear South Boston, they might have the almost romanticized idea, Goodwill Hunting, Southie, those kind of terms, right? Can you explain to me exactly what South Boston was like from what you would remember of it from in 1974? Exactly what are we dealing with there, in this ingrained, almost tribalistic nature of the people there and the community there as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't grow up in South Boston. I was in a suburb, but I remember I had friends that grew up there and so forth. And I can tell you that it is, you hit the nail on the head. It was a very sort of a tribalistic sort of situation. There was South Boston and there was Charlestown, and there were two very heavily populated areas of Irish people. And in a way, the Irish were relegated to second-class citizenry when they came over in the 1800s after the Irish famine and during the Irish famine. The Yankee, old-time establishment in Boston didn't accept them. Obviously, the no Irish need apply kind of thing, and so they were repressed in their own way, and I think they huddled in their own communities, Southie and Charlestown and so forth. And if it, and I hope with the film, I sort of dive into the psychology around racism. Sometimes an oppressed people can be the biggest racists because it's almost it's almost therapy for them to say, okay, well, I'm being repressed, but there's a group over here that's worse than I am, kind of thing. And to me, it's almost a form of self-medication, where you have as a group, you have a group that's has low self-esteem, and they can only cope with it, in a very, or some people can only cope with it in a very specific way, and they try and find fault with other people and so forth, and it spirals into a horrible attitude and a violent attitude, because they're repressing a lot of anger in their own right. And I think that's essentially part of what the film is about, and trying to analyze that mentality of what how racists are, what motivates them and so forth. But
the note that I had on when I was watching the movie was that hatred begat hatred. It kind of felt like it was something that I wouldn't say like cultural to like the Irish experience as a whole, but there in that neighborhood, essentially, it feels like that it was almost like attitudes passing from one generation to another, even in a kind of less kind of like under the radar kind of thing. So you have like the McLaughlin clan, which was led by Malcolm McDowell. They're very much kind of like almost like a gang of sorts there. And their racism is very much part of who they are, and they open about it and such. Whereas when you talk about the Coughlin clan, where Justin Chatwin plays the main character, Bill Coughlin, who's a police officer, the racism there is not so. He doesn't feel himself to be racist, but just because he's grown up essentially with bad elements, it kind of peters kind of through, kind of like almost kind of like a filters through unconsciously, I think, as well, to the point where his daughter even picks up some of the behaviors that his father had. And so when he's called out by a fellow police officer, he kind of has to question himself about it as well. It's a very kind of interesting dynamic within the families.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hopefully with the film, I created sort of a dynamic because then there's the Jeremy Piven character who the Justin Chatwin character would have grown up to be like him. Yeah. In a lot of ways. That was his influence. He was influenced by his whole, that tribe that he grew up in. But Justin, who plays this, Bill Coughlin, Bill's attitude was tempered by his marriage. And I specifically made his wife, played very skillfully by Anna Matrunin. She was not Irish specifically. I made her, a foreigner coming to this country at an early age, and that she was teased and bullied as a kid. And because Bill loves his wife, obviously, and can sympathize with her, and that's what tempered him and made him, realize that the actions of what he used to do as a kid. But is that tendency still there in him? Yeah, that's what he's struggling with. Yeah. And so on the one hand, he's influenced by his wife. On the other hand, he's, some of his, when his wife isn't around, he's just with his daughter. Some of that rubs off on her, plus the influence, the tribal influence that she has in growing up in Southie. And then all of a sudden it comes to a head, and with this whole busing thing, and he realizes, my daughter's turning out like I would have turned out had I not. And that scares him, and certainly scares his wife as well. So.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by 80s Tees. 80s Tees is an online retailer of licensed t-shirts and pop culture gear from your favorite movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, comic books, and musicians. Celebrate your inner 80s nerd and click on the link in the show notes below to get the raddest retro t-shirts delivered to your door. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Loot Crate. Founded in 2012, Loot Crate is the worldwide leader in fan subscription boxes. Loot Crate partners with industry leaders in entertainment, gaming, sports, and pop culture to deliver monthly themed crates, produce interactive experiences in digital content, and film original video productions. No matter what you geek out about, Loot Crate has a subscription box for you. To get your very own exclusive collectibles, apparel, and gear delivered to your door, be sure to click on the link in the show notes below. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you love. What I find interesting as well in the movie is that whether it's Bill's wife or whether it's Terrence Howard's character, they've pretty much are preaching the same kind of message within their families to make sure that everyone has a even head and looks in it in a different perspective. And the message is very much a spiritual, religious one, which I think is very beneficial because at that time in the civil rights movement, a big kind of philosophical part of the civil rights movement at that time was scripture and religion-based stuff. And his name is Reverend Martin Luther King for a reason. A lot of his writings evoked a lot of the teachings of the Gospels and such. Often they'll bring up kind of like what we talk about, love thy neighbor. And it's even a really great line that I have in here from the movie where one of the characters says, "Love thy neighbor." It sounds so simple. It can be really hard though. I think that's really an essential part. And like you mentioned before about how you feel like there's been a regression over the years in regards to way kind of racial relations are in America at the moment. My personal belief is that a lot of that kind of like the spiritual context of it that the original fathers of the civil rights in the 1960s had in their speech, I think a lot of that is missing these days, where people can say, love thy neighbor. It's talk about the character within. It's talk about how everyone is sons and daughters of God and should be seen that way, not by the color of the skin, but the content of their character. I think a lot of that is missing. That's just my perspective. Is that something that you feel as well?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of those lines in the film are about because of the spirituality of the characters. The Terrence Howard, as well as Anna Matrunan's character, the Pat Coughlin, and so forth. They were religious people, and just in trying to be true to the characters they had to be written that way. I don't have any religious bent as far as that's concerned, but it just those were the characters. In order to make them believable, that's what they believed in, and that was certainly, as you're absolutely right, it was part of the civil rights movement, which I always find it fascinating these days that religious people, so-called religious people, can also be, or spiritual people can also be racist, which it makes no sense to me. But as far as I'm concerned, there's no religious agenda on my end. I'm more into the psychology of it all, and to me, my theory about racism in a lot of ways is, it's sort of, and the theme for all the movies that I've done in 30 years has been pretty much the same, which is that people, suffering comes from not being able to face the reality that we all have by fighting change. I mean, as the Dalai Lama says, I mean, the only thing permanent in the world is impermanence. We're living constantly with change, and when we fight change, we that's what causes suffering in the world. If we understood the true nature of reality, that change is inevitable, and the only way to be happy is to accept it, and that to me is the underlying tenet of every religion, which is accepting change, and that's the problem with this situation, especially racism. I mean, and to me, 1974 in Boston was the perfect microcosm to express this idea, which is that all of a sudden everything's peaceful, everything's fine, everybody's living in their own little tribe, and then boom, change. They all of a sudden everybody has to deal with the fact that we have to deal with people that we've never dealt with before. So how to react to that? I mean, the healthy way, however you get there, whatever your religion is, however you get there, the healthy way is to say, okay, this is an opportunity. This is a good thing. We're embracing the change that's about to come because it's inevitable anyway. And no one does that. They all go back to their corners and try and fight it out. And that's what causes suffering. It's what causes violence, everything. And that's really the key to happiness, in my opinion. And that's and the raison d'etre for me, as far as a filmmaker, is to create that films that outline and that have that theme of people dealing with change. I think all art actually has to, when you come right down to it, you boil it down, that it always deals with a very similar theme, because we're all just human beings trying to be happy, and we just don't get how to do it.
I think another thing that for myself, like one of the on top of the topic you're talking about with change, so there's the two F's, which is fear and forgiveness. There's an interesting scene in your movie where near the start of the film, where it is announced that they're going to blend the two different high schools. One were predominantly white, one predominantly black, and they're going to mix the students together. One of the fathers of the students is like, "How dare they do this? If they touch you, it's like kind of like almost like an apocalyptic event." And the day after his daughter actually goes to the school, they're just like, "Anything happen? No. It wasn't that bad. No, it was fine. I actually made friends." It was like, it was so built up in their head that it will be the worst thing in the world, that kind of took over reason. I thought it was really interesting. And the other F of the movie is forgiveness. The movie ends with a really kind of interesting, I'm not going to say what it is, but really kind of interesting, I wouldn't say ambiguous, but it does leave them kind of like almost a cliffhanger. And it could determine the situation, the futures of these characters going forward. There's a great line in the film, a bad act doesn't make a bad person. And I found that to be really an incredible line. I think something that's really missing these days is the aspect of forgiveness. And I think a lot of it does come from that fear. People are afraid that if they forgive something that is different to them or that offends them, then that makes them less a person as well, which is different, actually. If you forgive, you actually makes you a bigger person. How important do you think that aspect is, the whole forgiveness aspect, especially in that last frame of your film, where one person is literally reaching out and saying, "I'm sorry, I did wrong, I want to be with you together," and the other person may or may not kind of like go ahead with that? How important is that aspect in regards to not only the characters in your movie, but just like the situation as a whole? Because I think forgiveness is the first step in stepping forward outside of that fear.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. That's a great question. I fought for that ending of the film. There was a lot of pressure to just say, "Oh, for God's sakes, just let them, have a happy ending so people can, But what the real purpose was, first of all, to say it's not that simple. You can't just reach out and say, "Okay, I get it. Let's just be friends now." Not after centuries of oppression and slavery and all the sins of this country and the sins of the world to all of a sudden just let go and say that it can't be that simple. There has to be some reconciling, and but by saying that, I left it ambiguous because I wanted to spark that discussion. What, I want people to leave the theater to say, okay, what should she do? Should she reach out or not? Without giving away the ending, but should she reach out or not? And I just left it there. We don't know what she does, and I'd like, the point being, I'd like people to really contemplate that. That's really that's really one. If I can at least achieve that with the audience, then I feel like I've been successful. The other point you brought up about, like, for example, it's all, that's absolutely true. The black kids that were bused into South Boston and Charlestown, there were, in those two areas, there were huge riots and violence and so on and so forth. The white kids that went into the black neighborhoods, not a single episode of violence. Everything was fine. It all worked the way it was supposed to work in the black neighborhoods. Everyone was accepting of each other. It was just when the black kids were being forced into the white neighborhoods that there was actually violence. And it says a lot about Boston at the time, and metaphorically about this country right now. So, it's something we really have to work on.
So for everyone out there listening, June 10 in theaters across the US, The Walk. I really recommend people check this movie out. It's got a really great cast: Justin Chatwin, the iconic Malcolm McDowell, Terrence Howard, Jeremy Piven, Katie Douglas, Sally Kirkland, Lovie Simone. I mean, such a great cast, do really great work here. And Daniel Adams, I thank you so very much for your time today. Thank you for being so patient with my queries, my questions. And
no.
I mean, really, it's a movie, as you can tell, that really kind of like struck a chord with me. And so great that we can talk about these things. I think above anything else, what they say, if you got to don't only talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. And I guess The Walk is a really good proof of that. So I thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and you got the hidden meaning of the title. So that's great.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.